Scripture reading this morning is going to be from 1 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him.
You can be seated. Thank you so much. It's a joy to be with you this morning, brothers and sisters, whether you're from here in the Springs or you're from visiting us from out of town, as is often the case here in our wonderful city. We're really glad that you've decided this is the right place to be on a Sunday morning in March now of 2025. We're glad that you've decided to spend your time here in the presence of God and with His people. I hope everybody got a family report as you were coming in this morning. That's our weekly bulletin. On the back page, there's a place to take notes along with the message, and if you didn't get one of those, Alex and Jason, two of our deacons, are out here working to make sure that you can. Just raise your hand and let them know. We'll pass one to you. I want to let you know about a couple of things, just kind of put them on your radar. One of them starts this afternoon. That would be our series with Brother Jared Saltz. For all of the Sundays in March, we're going to have a 4 p.m. service here in this room, and mostly it's going to be what you would call like a lectureship or a Bible forum. We're not planning to sing or any of that kind of stuff, but we are going to have some deep study in the Word, and we're going to have some good conversational study in the Word of God as well. Some chances to ask questions and have Jared respond to those. Jared, as most of you know, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway, Jared preaches for the Smoky Hill Church in Aurora. And before that, before he was their preacher, he came to them about a year and a half ago. Before that, he was a Bible professor at a Bible college, and his insights particularly into the Old Testament and the Hebrew side of all of that and how the Jews understood God well and how they understood him poorly at times, his insights into all of that kind of stuff are just really, really special. So you will be blessed. You will learn some deep stuff about God and His people through the Old Testament by being here this afternoon if you can make the time. And that's again at 4 o'clock this afternoon. And then the other one is, just a quick note, because this is about a month away, there is an area-wide song service scheduled for April the 6th, Sunday afternoon, up at the same church at Smoky Hill in Aurora. And so if you can make the drive, or if you want to just carpool with somebody, you know, we can drive together. But it would be a good thing for you. It would be a blessing for all of us if we could be there and share that with our brothers and sisters from all over the Front Range. So just wanted to put both of those on your radar, make sure that you're thinking about both of them. I also wanted to note, I had a note in the family report about Perry Burrows still being really sick, and he might still be sick, but Perry's sitting right there. So, brother, we're glad you're doing well enough to be here. It's really, really good to see you today. Glad to have you with us for an assembly time. All right, I think that's all that I had in terms of housekeeping. Let's get going in our message this morning. The Ten Commandments are God's first revelation of His will for an entire nation of people. And to my mind, they are still the finest example of a moral national law that's ever been given. The Ten Commandments are ubiquitous. You see them everywhere, whether you realize it or not. It seems like almost everybody recognizes the Ten Commandments at least as a title, sometimes as a depiction, sometimes as a picture, and often just as a concept. And that's why you can see it used for everything from courthouse decorations to blog titles. The Ten Commandments of, you know, whatever it may be, backcountry camping or canning or, I don't know, embroidery or whatever it's going to be. I've seen all of these, by the way. They're all real. Blog titles out there on the internet, but there's always the 10 commandments of this thing, right? And we understand that works because we're used to seeing them, we're used to knowing that these are 10 foundational core ideas, that these have to be there, and if you don't have these 10, you don't really have much of anything else to go on. That's why we use them in so many different ways. That's why they are so ubiquitous and they show up in so many different places. And that, I think, even by itself, probably tells us that they're worth us pausing in life sometimes and thinking deeply on the actual 10 commandments. Because if they are still treated as the model for a core set of ideas, then we better understand them as the original core set of ideals for the nation that would follow God. They were extremely important when they were first given, partly because they are the foundational core ideas, and partly because they were the only 10 commandments out of 611 or so commandments that the people actually heard the voice of God speak. They were crucially important to the Israelites, and they are still important for us today. I think a lot of us will have heard it said that the 10 Commandments are no longer binding on us because we're under the new covenant and the old law has been done away with, but Jesus brought 9 of the 10 Commandments forward into the new covenant. Probably a lot of us have heard that in church growing up. And I have to say that to some degree I agree with that, because we're not bound to the old covenant that God made with Israel through Moses. We are bound to an all-new covenant that he talked about in the book of Jeremiah and then repeated in the book of Hebrews, that is through Christ and our faith in him. That much is true. And so while in the most technical sense we don't have to obey the 10 Commandments just because they're the 10 Commandments, on a whole bigger set of ideas here, let's just acknowledge the fact that these 10 commandments teach us principles that are enduring through all the time that the Lord lets the earth stand. And I do mean even the Sabbath principle, and for those of you who are wondering. So all 10 of them have something powerful to teach us, and in many ways the principles are something that we are still called and compelled to obey. And that's why I think it's worth us studying them, and that's why I'd like you to open your Bible again to Exodus chapter 20, just as we did last week when we started this series. Exodus chapter 20, page 57. Because the principles that the 10 teach us for a free society, for quality family lives, for individual spiritual health and an enduring walk with Christ, all of those principles are still very, very powerful. But as much as I agree with that, much as I believe what I just told you, I bet that if you scan through the 10 Commandments, the one that we're going to look at today, the second commandment, probably doesn't sound like the most relevant of the bunch. Even though it's important, even though it's still true, it may not sound to our modern ears as the most relevant of the bunch. But I want to tell you this morning that there are still plenty of reasons why we need this word governing our walk with God, just as the Israelites did. The second of the 10 words, starting in Exodus 20, verse 4, says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." Now, as I said, this may be one of those commandments that to our modern ears doesn't sound like it's necessarily the most relevant or the most needed teaching in our day, because who's really bowing down before statues and worshiping those? But I want to show you 3 facets of the value of this one that still speak to us. Let's talk about it from 3 points of view here. And for my note takers, those of you looking at the family report outline, you can fill these in real fast here, and then we'll come back and flesh each one out. I want to talk about this commandment's theological value. I want to talk about its national value, and then I want to talk about its personal value. So the first one of those will take a good deal more time than the second and the third, just letting you know, so that you don't think, man, this took forever with point 1. We're going to be here till way after lunch. No. I know what I'm doing. We got it. We're good. Okay, so anyway, let's talk about its theological value first. The theological value of this second word. And maybe the first thing that we ought to do here is differentiate a couple of terms, namely the terms idol and statue, okay? Because I think to a casual reader who's not really paying close attention, it might sound like God repeated himself with the second commandment. Because the first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods," and then the second commandment says, "You shall have no other gods," right? No, not exactly. Because what's happening is in the first commandment, God is commanding his people, don't let anything hold your heart other than me. And that's a thing that regulates our very thoughts. It regulates our very attitude toward existence and faith. When God says in the first commandment, don't let anything other than me hold sway over your heart, that's a commandment that legislates our very thoughts and everything about our lives. The second commandment, though, is more specific. And the second commandment is one that prohibits a certain type of action, not just the heart, but a certain type of action. The second commandment is a command not to make statues of gods, not to make visible representations of any god, even their God. And that's the thing that makes these two different. That's why it's important for us to see right here that God is not just repeating himself as though he needed to just really emphasize that first commandment, so he made it the second one too. It is that he's telling them to avoid a specific set of behaviors in which they would be tempted, and we still are in some ways, to make images that we can see to represent what God is. The first commandment is about who to worship. The second commandment is about how and how not to worship God. So read it again with me, if you will. This is Exodus 20, verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or in earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. Now, you can already tell it from the way that I worded the point here on the screen, but let me just go ahead and make a very particular emphasis here, that it does not say, you shall not make for yourself a carved image of other gods. It says more broadly, you shall not make for yourself a carved image and bow down to that, which includes then the prohibition that they cannot make for themselves a carved image of any likeness of any created thing. But it also means you cannot make for yourself an image that you think represents Yahweh, your God, and bow down to that. And that, brothers and sisters, is one of the laws in the Torah that makes God's people utterly unique from their neighbors. Because in the pagan way of thinking, in the way that every other culture that has ever worshipped idols has thought, how in the world could you even worship a God unless you knew he was there? If you can't see him, how can you worship him? That's why their temples dot the landscape of their cultures for millennia as we keep doing the archaeological digs. We find the statues and the temples, and we find all of these visual representations of these gods that show how important it was to them to have something tangible and visible that they could look to know their God was with them. That's what their whole MO was. That was the pagan mindset. And to see a nation of people that even when they build a temple, when you go in it, there's no statue. Even in his temple, there's no representation of the presence of this God. Now, granted, the temple itself is the representation of his presence, but can you understand the pagan way of thinking and how different this command made Israel from all of their neighbors? And the thing that I think that teaches us for all of time, and we'll spend a good amount of our time this morning on this one point, the thing that I think that teaches us for all of time is that Yahweh God is a God who asks for faith. Other gods ask for sight. Ours is a God who asks us to have faith. In the opening verses of Hebrews 11, we get a brief description of the crucial things that faith has and faith does. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, and it is the evidence of things not seen. I need you to lock on to that idea for the rest of our time this morning, that when we look at the second commandment, we are looking at one of God's places in the entirety of his revealed word, where he emphasizes, I have not been seen. It is not sight that defines our devotion to God. It is faith. And this is a really important point all the way through the rest of the Bible. That's one of the things that God has always insisted on among his people, is that he exists as a God who is not seen. Now, Moses realized this and the importance of this, and you can tell that from Deuteronomy. Can you go 2 books to the right in your Bible and look at a couple of things with me? Deuteronomy, Moses is essentially preaching a sermon series. It's his last set of speeches that he's going to make to the people of Israel before they leave him behind and they go into the promised land, but he stays out. And it's this long series of sermons where he's basically telling them, remember where you came from, remember how God brought you out of Egypt and through the wilderness and how he's now brought you into the land. And when you go in the land, these are the things you need to remember to hold your relationship with God together and make it great. Now, one of the crucial parts of that is in Deuteronomy chapter 4. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, we have this long section where he talks about how if they obey the will of God, then they will be a wise people in the sight of their neighbors, and their neighbors will look up to them and see all that wisdom. But here's one of the things that sets that apart as different from what those neighboring nations do. Verse 12. Verse 12, the Lord spoke to you at Sinai out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 commandments, and he wrote them on tablets of stone, etc., etc. But look again at verse 15. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw no form on that day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourself in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, anything that creeps on the ground, or any fish in the water under the sea. And he goes on to warn them about all the other tendencies of pagan cultures where they look to the world around them and they say, that impressive thing, that powerful thing, that skillful thing, that must be what God is like. Let me make that into my God. You see, the warning that he's making there is don't turn your eyes to the things that you can see. Turn your heart to God who cannot be seen. Same chapter, scan down to verse 32. Moses tells them, ask now for the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as your freedom from Egypt has ever been done, or has ever happened, or ever been heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of the fire as you have heard, and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might discipline you, and that you might know that the Lord is God. There is none other besides him. You see the emphasis, and this is not the only place, not the only chapter of Deuteronomy where this is done, but you see the emphasis on the fact that they heard God, but they never saw him. And he adamantly desired that they would never see him. They saw what he could do. They saw the presence of his power. They saw the devastation that he enacted upon Egypt. But they never laid eyes on God himself. And he insisted that they should never create a visible form of him to use in worshiping him, which again makes the God of the Bible and his unique people unique from all the other nations around them. Because the other nations and their gods, they rarely require the same thing that God does of his people. He requires our hearts to be faithful to him. The gods of the other nations, they don't really require that. They're right there. You can see them. You can walk into their temple and just, there it is. That's the presence of that God. Like Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. He's depicted in castings and sculptures from across the ancient world. And you know what he looks like? He looks like a human king. But at least you could see your God, right? Even if he's not that impressive or that unique, At least you could see your God, right? Or Dagon, the god of the Philistines, the one who bore the image of a fish. I don't know. You can go in his temple, you can see him, but is it really that impressive? No, especially when you think about the passage that was read right before I got up and what happened to that particular God in the presence of God, of Yahweh. Or Thoth, one of the gods of the Egyptians. His image is based on a bird that you see all the time up and down the banks of the Nile River. It's real easy to come by. But you walk into its temple and at least you go, well, it may not be that impressive or unique of a thing, but at least we can see our God here. You see, that's the idea. That's the mentality that leads people to worship idols and create visual representations of their gods. But the problem with it, can I just say, is that to me, it sounds a lot like going to Build-A-Bear. You go to Build-A-Bear, you pick your base idea, you dress it up a little bit, however you want it to look. You pick a name for it, you give it some accessories, and there you go. You have everything that you ever wanted, at least when you walk out of the mall that day, right? But you know what? There's a passage in Acts that mentions a man named Demetrius and a whole group of craftsmen like him whose livelihood was based on a build-a-god concept. That what you would do is you would choose the wood, you would choose the metals, you would choose its name and its look, and you would just have somebody make that for you, and you would walk away and take it home with you, and it would just fulfill every dream and every wish that you ever had, at least that day when you left the mall. You know? Isn't it just fascinating that all of these gods, which are no gods, fit into such a typical pattern of being made by us? And they fail so miserably at the much more powerful way of life, which chooses to live by faith in a powerful God who just cannot be seen. All of the gods that are created by human cultures are something that we build out of our own minds, or at least out of our own vision of the world. We're not creating anything. We're actually just reorganizing what God already created and saying, now that replaces him. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. And it presents such a marked contrast with the God who told Moses, you cannot see my face and live, but you can believe in me and have life without end. Yahweh, brothers and sisters, is a God who asks us to believe. And part of the reason for that is that he is a God too grand to be compared with anything we can see anyway. It simply doesn't make sense. And Isaiah actually talked about this. Isaiah asked in chapter 40, with whom will you compare Yahweh? It's a rhetorical question. There's no answer to that. Are you going to make an image and say that's like him? No, there's no comparison. The two are far apart from each other. There's no way. And so it's interesting that God compares himself to a number of things in scriptures. He talks about himself as a husband jealous for his bride. He talks about himself as a mother who cares for her children. He talks about himself as a father who provides and protects and governs and disciplines his children. He talks in those terms. But the fact that there are multiples of them tell us the fact that God cannot be contained by one image. He himself can describe elements of himself in one image, but it just doesn't contain the whole of who he is. And that's why we don't try to compare him to anything else. We don't try to encapsulate him and to put him in a box or put him on a stand, more literally, where we can see the entirety of his representation. It's a bit like when we take paintings of the Rocky Mountains, and I can talk to this group and you know what I'm talking about because you live here in the shadow of these. Have you ever seen a painting or a photo of the Rockies that did any justice in capturing its breadth and grandeur and splendor? What about the Andes? What about the Himalayas? You've seen pictures of all of them, but until you're actually there, there's no real sense of what it's actually like. Can I just tell you that when we try to create an idol, even if Israel had tried to create a visual representation of Yahweh their God, which apparently they did in Exodus 32 with the golden calf, I don't care how grand and glorious the image is, it pales in comparison to the depth and the splendor and the glory of the real thing. It's like looking at an image of the Rockies and saying, I've been to the Rockies. No, you haven't. You haven't been anywhere close if all you have is the picture, no matter how big the picture is. And that's the problem with idols, that they are a puny representation of something vast and glorious and wonderful. And we look at the puny representation and we say, now that is really something amazing. That's as good as it gets. It's not even close. It's not even close to the real thing. And so when you realize what this command is doing is it's helping us preserve our understanding of God as He truly is. And that makes it make sense for its national value as well. That when you had a whole nation of people who could come to terms with that idea, you would have a people who were truly blessed by having no idols of their God or anybody else's God among them. That would be a people who were a free people. They are free because their God goes with them everywhere, and because their God cannot be stolen by an invading nation. How many times did that happen, or how many times did they think that had happened, which is what the whole story was about the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel that was read a little while ago. That whole thing was just showing that they misunderstood what the Ark of the Covenant was in the first place. That wasn't their God. Their God is not constrained and confined to a place and a time. He can't be stolen by an invading nation because He's not physically localized to right there. He is everywhere. He is with them all the time. And so that makes them a free people. It also makes them a unique people. And I know that sometimes we look at being unique and we go, I don't want to be the one who stands out from the crowd. But I think when we look through the scriptures, we see how often it's really wonderful to be the one that stands out from the crowd. God's flipping that whole idea on its head and telling us that's exactly what you should be. You should be the nation of people that, yes, the others around you think you're strange, but give them time and live the way you're supposed to, and they will see how wonderful your way of life really is. Because you are not only a unique people, you are unique because you are a righteous people. You don't look to the heavens, you don't look to the earth, you don't look to the seas and say, that's the thing. Whatever we see in any of those realms, those are the things that are the amazing, life-changing, world-shaping presences. No, that's wrong. It's simply wrong. But it is right to look up with the eyes of faith into the heavens and to know Yahweh, our God, and to say He alone is our God. And that gets us back to the thing that I said a few minutes ago about them being God's truly special, chosen people. If you're still open to Deuteronomy, can we go back to chapter 4 for a second? Let's look at verses 5 through 8. You're probably going to hear me read these handful of sentences quite a few times in this series because I think Moses is just letting us in on such a wonderful insight right here when he thinks about how God has governed His people. Look at Deuteronomy 4, verse 5. See, I have taught you statutes and rules, as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever, and we could put in parentheses, wherever, we call upon Him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? The fact that they didn't worship actual statues is a huge component of these people understanding themselves as a people that belong to Yahweh God. They are free from the confinement of an idol that sits in its temple or in somebody's house. They are free to worship their God anywhere and everywhere and all the time. And they can trust by faith that He always hears and that he always is with them. And that's the personal value of this whole thing, that it gets us to where this connects with us. In Romans chapter 1, Paul actually makes a good long commentary on the practice throughout all the pagan cultures of history of creating idols. And he says what's really fascinating and sad about those cultures is how often they've created an idol in the image of mankind. And you can see this, by the way, very literally played out, because what was the chief god? What were all the gods, matter of fact, of the Greco-Roman world? They were all human forms, weren't they? Zeus is always pictured as this god he is old in face, but he's strong and young in body. Wonder why that is. Because their picture of the gods is only as good as the best version of humanity. And that's the thing here. The personal value of this, as Paul talks about it even there, is that it frees us to enjoy unrestricted faith. Now, obviously, I'm talking to a group of people that knows I don't mean faith with no restrictions. What I mean is faith that is not restricted to the most powerful thing our imagination can come up with. Our faith is not restricted to the place where we see that temple sitting on a hilltop. Our faith is not restricted to whether the God is awake or asleep, to whether he is the right God for the situation I'm in, or I need to choose another one because this isn't really that one's wheelhouse. Our faith is not restricted by those things. Our faith is put in the God of heaven and earth, the one that Jonah described when he was in the middle of the ocean, or was in the middle of the storm on the ocean with all those foreign sailors. He said, I worship the God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea. That God is not confined to just, can we pray to him because right now we're in a storm and we need to see God to rescue us? No. You pray to this God because he's in charge of all of it. Your faith is not restricted to realms, to time, to fatigue, to places, and to titles and to images. Your faith, brothers and sisters, our faith is in the God who transcends all of that. And yes, he has made himself plain in a human, that he has taken on the form of a human. But we dare not ever assign him that with all of our understanding of how that would constrict him. He still breaks our paradigm for understanding, even in human form. And so we dare not restrict him to the ways that we want to believe in him. We better choose to just let him be who he is, with no restraint. And we'll struggle as much as we have to try and understand that. And then the second thing that ultimately does is it leaves us free to appreciate the true glorious form of Yahweh our God. Romans chapter 1, Paul's exact wording there, he talks about people who have exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling man and beast and birds and fish and all this kind of stuff. It's fascinating to me, and it's very sad to me that we would ever do that any humans who know Yahweh would ever exchange the true glory of who he really is in all of his invisible grandeur and splendor and love and wrath and everything for some image that we've created of a man or an animal. That's not what we want. We don't want, brothers and sisters, the man upstairs. We don't. We want Yahweh our God. We want to be heard. We want our prayers to be heard by him, not by just some man who happens to be in a higher elevation than us. We don't want to recreate him in our own image. We want to understand ourselves made in his image and let all of that become more and more a part of who we are. God is the one we worship, and the only limits upon our understanding of him and who he is are our own minds and hearts. And so the command has its principles that still ring true for us when we hear these words. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. The 10 words still do have tremendous impact in our lives. They regulate what we do because they teach us who we should be. And that's what we're trying to learn from this as we try to learn the heart of God from these principles that are eternal and long-standing in their nature. So, my hope for you is that your heart does not belong to any other God, and that your heart does not belong to any tiny little puny representation of the true God. My hope is that your heart belongs to Him and to His Son, the only one who can save us. And if that's not where you're at in your life, then I would love to talk to you about what that means. And if I can help you with that, I'll open the Word of God and I'll do my best with it. And so would any of the shepherds of this church, the elders of this church as well. We want to talk to you. We want to help you to walk fully and completely and truly with Him. And so if we can, and you want to make that known publicly, why don't you come and talk to one of us while we stand and sing this hymn together?